Hi guys, welcome to our session. My name is Joshua Shellhammer. I'm one of the senior product managers too at Appian. Myself and Daryl today, we're going to be going over Stratus, which is another way that we refer to our Appian Cloud platform. So today we want to kind of go over a little more details about what actually makes up Stratus, what we're doing now, and then maybe some things that are going to be coming in the future. So I'm going to hand it off to Daryl, and then I'll be back for the next section.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, I'm Daryl Mitchell. I'm a senior product manager responsible for foundational infrastructure within the platform engineering SBU at Appian. And so, yeah, excited to talk about something we haven't really discussed much in public before. So you may be familiar with this meme or cartoon. You're sort of saying this is fine as the world burns down around you. Nothing's burning, nothing to worry about, but it could be representative of a software company that doesn't have a cloud native strategy in 2024. Having an answer for platform engineering for cloud native extends throughout the business, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. Thankfully, though, Appian doesn't have to live with that reality. Some of you may have been at Appian World in 2022. Jessica Martinez gave a talk about how Appian was leading the cloud native revolution at that time, and now we're reaping the benefits of that. And not only have we delivered a cloud native solution for Appian Cloud customers, but we also have a solution for self-managed customers, and we're going to cover that as well. So we're going to talk about what a cloud native platform is, define that in case you're not familiar. We're going to talk about how we define Stratus, which is, you could call it a code name for what our newest generation of Appian Cloud is. Then Josh is going to go into scaling Appian Cloud on Stratus. And then we're going to talk about Appian on Kubernetes, which is our self-managed offering of the same cloud native technology that operates Stratus. So what is a cloud native platform? Cloud native platform is one of the most strategic technology trends for 2024. Gartner, pretty respected resource for these sorts of conversations. And I've highlighted here in red platform engineering and industry cloud platforms. They're important, especially for a company like Appian that's hosting software and making it available to customers. However, they're not necessarily the easiest concept to sell to non-technical stakeholders in a software company. Defining what they are, defining how they work and what the benefit is can be a challenge. And I sort of relate this to digital transformation. It was mentioned this morning in the keynote. It's still happening. It's been happening for over a decade. And cloud native is sort of the newest generation of that when it comes to delivering software. So what is a cloud native platform? And what is platform engineering, rather? So Gartner defines platform engineering as an emerging technology approach that can accelerate the delivery of applications and the pace at which they produce business value. And so in our case, platform engineering improves the non-low code developer experience. And I say that because developer is a loaded term for Appian. It can mean developers working on the low code platform. It can mean software engineers. In our case, we're really talking about the internal teams who are building the products that you, the customer, are consuming. So low code platform, process automation, unified mining, elastic scale, the elastic process execution. Attended a good session on that earlier. All of that's rooted in Stratus and in this cloud native platform. And so one of the things I wanted to point out here is if you look at this, this chart on the left, there's a lot of infrastructure complexity below what you see with the product and service teams up at the top. And really, you customers are even above that. So there's a lot of complexity that goes into the foundational infrastructure. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about Stratus. So what is Stratus? Stratus is the next generation of Appian Cloud. It's a cloud native platform that enables Appian teams to innovate more quickly, efficiently, and securely than ever before. I recognize that sounds salesy and markety, but it's true, and I'm going to show you why that is. So what is Stratus? Where does it sit sort of in the stack? You've probably seen this diagram in various sessions or in the keynote. And I've sort of circled at the bottom what we're really referring to here. We're talking about, really, with Stratus, we're talking about the Appian managed Appian Cloud. And so it can be a little confusing to keep up with the terminology, but Appian Cloud comprises all of our hosted offerings of Appian and all of our products. There's a first generation environment that is still in production and still in use. But then there's also Stratus, which is our newest environment. And we're going to talk a little bit about how some of the services are natively run, natively designed and developed in Stratus, but they're also available to the first generation of cloud customers as well. So there's really a lot of sort of uniformity there that we can take advantage of. So some of you may be familiar with the concept of migration to the cloud native infrastructure. You may already have your production sites running in Stratus. It's really Kubernetes backed. If you're familiar with Kubernetes, you sort of see the logo there with the little ship steering wheel. And so, Stratus is what we're calling our state-of-the-art technical foundation. It allows us to enable future capabilities such as elastic scale, zero downtime upgrades, but it's not all of Appian Cloud, like I said. We're actually about 40% of the way through migrating customers from the first generation of Appian Cloud into Stratus, into the native Kubernetes architecture. And so we expect that to be done by the end of the year. And if you haven't heard about it, you will for sure. So the most important question, you probably came here, is does it have AI? That's all anybody wants to know. It does. It has AI in more than one way. Appian Protect was actually announced last year at Appian World. Miguel Guerra is one of our senior product managers within connectivity, and he announced Appian Protect. And Appian Protect does monitor network traffic to detect intrusion risks. It uses AI to do that. There's also a human element to that, which goes along with Appian's philosophy on AI generally. You work together, AI and humans. And then otherwise, it also enables AI to offer as a product to you all. And so all of our AI, automation and generative AI capabilities are all rooted and natively built in Stratus, and again, made available to sites, whether they're in the first generation or in the Stratus environment. So I want to talk about the key principles of Stratus. The first is elastic scale. There's a number of sessions you could probably attend that talk about elastic scale, and we're going to cover how Stratus enables that, especially Josh. He's going to go into that in detail. Multi-tenancy, and depending on who you ask, multi-tenancy might be kind of a curse word, but I'm going to tell you it's not anything to be afraid of, and I'm going to talk about why. And then zero trust, which is a bit of an industry buzzword, but it is an important concept for how we've thought out Stratus. So up first, elastic scale. And so I like to sort of use the analogy of like a rubber band. You can expand, you can contract, but it sort of stays mostly the same. And so we achieve this using a technology known as containerization. And Google actually defines containers as lightweight packages of application code together with dependencies. And so for those of you who are maybe less technical, basically instead of having to have a whole dedicated machine, dedicated computer, you can just have whatever your application is combined with the dependencies and run that in a very modular way. So the graphic is meant to sort of demonstrate that, sort of like a container ship. You can densely pack a lot of functionality into a smaller environment with less resources. And so that allows us to have more resiliency, more scale than dedicated predecessors. So instead of having a machine that one piece of it fails and brings the entire thing down, you can separate out into these distinct services, and it enables a lot more scale, a lot more resiliency than you would have had originally. So multi-tenancy. This is one of the key takeaways that I want to have, from this talk. Appian is really committed to keeping you, the customer, and your data safe. It's one of our key principles for Appian Cloud. And in Stratus, we are pursuing elastic scale. We are pursuing that resiliency that I mentioned. And as part of that, we're building in multi-tenancy. But within that multi-tenancy, we are still doing per customer isolation. So your low-code site that runs in your cloud site that runs in Stratus still has an isolated instance and an isolated database. And I don't necessarily mean isolated from every other customer, but what I mean is that your data is encrypted and belongs only to you. That data is not sitting in a database with some other customer, and that machine is not shared with any other customer, machine being your cloud site. But some of these new Appian services, some of the unified mining, for example, they actually may have databases that share metadata and other things about you and other customers. In that case, we use an external service to encrypt that data, encrypt the objects stored in the database. There's zero knowledge of other customers. So even though you're actually on sort of shared infrastructure, you're not actually at any risk of any overlap there with other customers. And again, it's multiple layers of encryption in that case. So I wanted to tell a story on that note, talking about those services. Document extraction is obviously a product that we offer, and they are taking advantage of Stratus. They've developed their product on top of Stratus, and they were working with a customer to adopt new functionality that was announced in 23.4 last year. And so in January, when they were working to migrate, they discovered a not really a problem, but an improvement that would be needed to speed up the process of actually adopting that feature. And they were able to actually, from the point of sort of conception and request of that feature to production readiness and being in production, they were able to deliver that in under a week. And so this is sort of a model for how we want to be able to deliver all services at Appian and in Appian Cloud. And so, there was no platform version change required. There was no downtime, no hotfix, no shortcuts, no compromises. It was basically the same software development lifecycle that we have, which is really robust, and applied to this, but it was possible to deliver it really quickly because of the methodology and the tooling that we've enabled as part of the Stratus platform. So the last component is, or key principle is zero trust. And so zero trust can mean a lot of different things depending on who you ask and who you talk to. In our case, we've done some marketing around zero trust. You can find that online. This is essentially the same thing that we're reiterating here. We enforce hyper least privilege. So we do that via both policy and automation of as many tasks as possible. So policy means we're looking at individual AWS IAM scopes everywhere that they're used. It gets reviewed by someone before we put it into production. We are user groups and identity roles and things are all scoped as far down as possible, consistently vetted, reported on, and we ensure that that's really tightly controlled. We also verify everything often as it's being used. So we continuously require authentication in sessions where someone's accessing a system in both production and non-production environments. And we restrict those sessions to really short durations. So for example, if you're working in a really a production environment, you might only be able to use it for, or you can't leave it idle for more than 10 minutes. It automatically logs you out. You have to re-authenticate with multi-factor. And we use hardware multi-factor tokens as well, which protect us from some of those phishing attacks that are rooted in SMS or social engineering. And then the last thing is assume breach. So assume breach is more about your network posture. So basically, if you assume that two devices or services in your network, if you assume that there's going to be a breach and you don't want it to be compromised between the two, then we really tightly control how services can communicate with one another. So basically, we go through a process with our InfoSec team where we vet all of our designs and talk about what's the least amount of access we need to go across the network or between services. And we assume that if we were breached, what's the blast radius there? And then we tightly sort of control that. So now I'm going to hand it over to Josh, talk about scaling.
Cool. Thanks, Daryl. I'm much more of a podium kind of guy, so I'm just going to go over here so I don't fall over. Let's talk about scaling. A lot of the different sessions are talking about scaling. There's a lot of new products in Appian that are going to be promoting themselves as scaling. One of them you heard this morning, Elastic Process Execution. One of their sessions was earlier today. So I want to talk about some of the stuff that actually does scale right now. And I also want to talk about some things that we're also working on in the future, maybe giving an example and then cover some other details. So just to give you some by the numbers, we just jotted down looking at Q4 of last year, basically just some numbers showing you like what we're actually handling in Appian Cloud as of right now. So 8.4 million logins, 2.2 billion workflows, and 5,500 deployments. So this is a number as of Q4 of last year, but this number continues to grow. So as this number continues to grow and we have legacy products and we introduce new ones, we need to make sure that we're finding ways to be able to expand, but expand efficiently and appropriately. So as a Stratus cloud platform, we'll be able to stay afloat and still look good for customers as an option to use compared to on-prem. I will be saying a little bit more about how I want everyone to go to cloud because I am part of cloud, but I'll talk about Appian on Kubernetes a little bit later at the end of the presentation if you can't do that. So let's talk about scaling in general. So Daryl talked about some of the principles for Appian Cloud in general. Let's talk about scaling. So, with scaling at a perfect implementation, there are some key concepts that we want to make sure we cover. So we want to make sure that we're able to evenly distribute the load, right? We want to make sure that if we have like 3 instances of the application server, that when we have users come in, we're evenly distributing them, right? We don't want them all to go to one server and overload it while the other two are, just hanging out waiting for requests to come in. Elasticity, it's nice to scale up, but if you can't scale down, then you're not really being able to take, you know, advantage of, cost cutting or being efficient on the nodes that you might be spinning up. You don't want to keep spinning up more nodes, keep putting more pods in them, and then just keep adding resources over and over and over again, because obviously you're not being efficient. So we need to make sure that there will be room for these things to grow, but then also we won't overload either a customer's site, their individual nodes, or in the future, a lot of the cluster services that we're working on as well. And then efficient use of resources. Again, we just want to make sure that when we provision and allocate new pods, when we spin up new nodes, that we're not just making sure we spin them up when we need to, but also like what are the resources that are required for them. We don't want to over provision, we don't want to over allocate and give them things that aren't necessary, so that they can be used when they need to be used and not when they don't. So not to get too technical because we're not supposed to, but this is sort of just an example of, in a Kubernetes example, like what it would look like if like one service was scaling. So I'm not going to go through all these different pieces, but as you can see, like it can get pretty complex, right? So, I'm completely encompassed by a Kubernetes icon. And then within it, I have a namespace. And then I have the pods where I'm like, okay, maybe I have an application server, which I have 3 instances of that pod right now. But then what else do you have to keep in mind? Well, you have to keep in mind your resources. You have to keep in mind your reconciliation loop. Like, how do you actually scale? What's the limit? So, we're simplifying this because that's the point of this presentation, but just keep in mind that there's a lot of stuff that goes on. So, especially when it comes to services or things that have been in the Appian product for a very long time and have been used, migrating those over and having them to be able to take advantage of scaling does take quite a lot of time, and a lot of things need to be brought in or changed, especially when it comes to storage and provisioning specifically. So let's talk about what kind of scaling you can do with Kubernetes. So I'm going to cover the two most popular ones. I'm not going to talk about node scaling, but let's talk about the two different ones when it comes to pods, as we've been talking about. So we have horizontal pod auto scaling, which basically just means adding on additional pods or replicas of that service which you need to use. And then we have vertical pod auto scaling, which basically is just expanding the amount of resources that that pod has. So if we look at the next graphic here, we can see sort of visually what that means. Like HPA, or horizontal pod auto scaling, basically just continuing the count up or down of the instances that we have. Whereas VPA, we're basically just increasing it when we need the size to increase and then decreasing it when we don't need those resources anymore. So most of the services that Stratus uses were mostly, or at least the current implementation, we're mostly using HPA. So if I want to look at sort of like the cloud landscape as it currently exists, we talk a lot about low-code platforms. So some of the components that we categorize as part of the low-code platform would be elastic process execution, which they talked about this morning during the keynote. But that also includes the application server, service manager, all the different engines that are appropriate for different requests. But then we have these other components as well that are talking to the low-code platform. So we have AI skills, machine learning, process mining. The reason that I have these represented this way is because their current implementation is sort of separate. And the reason that it's separate right now is because these services, most of them have been built natively in Stratus. So they've built them in a way so that they can scale and function independently on their own, aside from the low-code platform. So the example that Daryl was giving before, because they've done it in a cloud native way, they're able to push forward and introduce fixes and or new functionality faster compared to the low-code platform, which everything is so tightly bundled that it's harder to make changes and get those changes and new features out quicker. Our goal is in the future to obviously improve that, and there's a lot of benefits from it. But like I said, the legacy services and that can just take obviously a lot more or additional time to actually implement. So if we're talking about scaling Stratus, let's just, again, reflect on what we can actually scale right now. So a lot of this stuff isn't, really documented explicitly, but as of right now, like we can scale portals, we can scale AI skills, and elastic process execution, which is coming with 24.3, we can scale as well. So these services are all set to, for one component or another, can scale horizontally to basically pick through like different types of load that are coming through for a different site that's currently being used in Stratus. So in the future, we have a goal to implement this with a lot more of our services. But like I said, some of the work that we're doing right now may take a few quarters or a little bit longer. But I can say, as someone who's working on this scalable resilient services squad, that this is something that we've been focusing on for the past 3 years and will continue to move forward with as well. So let's talk about what's next for scaling. So some of the things that we're focusing on right now that we really want to scale, we have a lot of good use cases and we'll say pressure from our customers as well, is application servers. So just being able to scale the number of Tomcat instances based upon the number of requests that are coming in. We know there's great benefits with that. I put Kafka here because even though we are specifically right now scaling Kafka for epics or elastic process execution, we also have another Kafka instance, which is used for the existing Kafka topics or the internal messaging service. In the future, we do plan to just use it all as one service. We don't want to have two different deployments of Kafka. But for right now, we're seeing really good results with elastic process execution using our current scaling Kafka deployment for them. So we just want to make sure that because they're going to be having such high workloads and high throughput, that we want to make sure that Kafka doesn't become a bottleneck for them and will affect their implementation. And then lastly, engines. Engines actually is an interesting one because there are a lot of engines. If you worked with Appian for a while, you're very well aware of that. And we'll continue to revolutionize and rework and redevelop some of the engines that we have. And when we do that, we kind of want to break away from the cycle that we have right now, where everything is sort of treated as like a monolith of engines. And we want to break them down into individual engines and be able to then manipulate them and scale them easier. So for Appian on Kubernetes customers, you may already be aware that right now we're doing a per pod per engine deployment. But internally for Stratus, we're not there yet. But we want to get the same benefits by breaking down the engines so then we can scale them independently and do that more efficiently. So let's just do a quick example if nobody knows what I'm talking about right now. So here's just an example of if the application server needed to horizontally scale, right? So on the left-hand side, I just have an existing node. Kubernetes is orchestrating it. And you can see at the top, the application server is taking in requests from our edge layer we have in place, and then it's talking to the search server and other components. So let's say that that application server hits some sort of threshold that we have set that says, okay, once I hit this threshold, I need to make sure that I have somewhere else for the request to also go, or otherwise my current users on that application server and my new users that come in could see some sort of detrimental performance problem, right? So what we can do here is, because that machine node 1 is already full in terms of the number of pods and the resources that I want to allocate out, I can spin up a new node, node number 2, and then just put the application server on there by itself. Now, I don't have any communication lines showing the application server 2 on node 2 talking to any of the other services on node 1, but it's just kind of understood that that communication would be happening. I just didn't want to make this too messy and too overwhelming. So the two servers will stay up for as long as they need to, but then just in case it does happen that you don't need application server number 2 anymore, we can then basically stop that pod. And if it's the only service or pod running on that node, we can also then just take the node down as well. So not to say that that node will automatically disappear or go away if that happens, but we might stand it up and wait for some other service to come through and need it. But in this example, we don't really need to. So this is just a very simplified view, but this is something that we've been working on actively for the application server over the past 3 years. So I think once we've prioritized and moved forward with the Kafka scaling, which is going to be released with epics, then we're really going to double down on application server and some of these other components in the future. Now, if you can't use Stratus, if Appian Cloud is just not an option, and you're looking for an alternative to doing this yourself, you're not interested in using self-managed Windows or self-managed Linux, then we do also have an offering called self-managed, or also known as Appian on Kubernetes. So this has been out for a while, but I feel like it's really starting to get a lot more popularity. So I kind of just wanted to go through a little bit of detail about it and help sell it for my other fellow product owner who's not here today, Joel. And I can connect you with him if you need to after this presentation. So let's just talk about comparing Kubernetes to traditional hosting, right? So Daryl already went over containerization and the benefits that you get from that. So we know that with containerization, it's easier and more powerful than just your traditional Windows installation or Linux installation, right? And then orchestration. I've been talking about scaling. Scaling is something that comes with Kubernetes, and that's a very powerful tool. But also things such as resiliency, and if a node goes down, if a pod goes down, Kubernetes will always make sure that your environment is what you define it to be. It'll always make sure that you're going to be at the optimal state for whatever you define it to be. And that's something that's very hard to replicate in other Windows or Linux. And then resilience, it's highly available, fault tolerant. Like there are all these controls put in place so then you don't have to worry about this portion or this architectural requirements as much, and you can focus on other things like scaling, basically. um, so just very high level how Appian Kubernetes works. So in terms of Kubernetes for these customers, what we're going to have is what's called a custom resource definition. So this definition will essentially say like, I want to allow these APIs, I want to set this structure, I want everything to happen in this exact way, right? So this custom resource will basically tell it exactly how things should be deployed. And then our Appian operator is basically going to use that custom resource to say like, okay, cool, tell me exactly what you want me to do, and I'm going to go out and deploy it. So tell me how many application servers, tell me what my threshold will be for when I need to scale up to another instance. Like all these things, it basically is just going to be communicating back and forth between all the pods and the nodes that are running and making sure that it's in that exact state at all times. And what's nice about the custom resource is that if you do need to make a change, you go out, you can update your custom resource, and then those changes will be picked up by the operator and deployed. It's not that simple, so I'm not going to say it is, but that's just a really high-level example of how it would happen if you were deploying itself. Because of the power of the Kubernetes reconciliation loop, that's how it's just going to be constantly just checking over and over again just to make sure that you have that optimal implementation as what you exactly want it to be. And there's a lot of documentation in the Appian public docs to kind of give you examples, give you like a starting point, and a lot of tips that go with it. So if you have any questions about it, please let us know. Our product owner is always open to talking to new customers that may be interested in it and maybe just don't have any experience with it at all. So let's say you are a Windows or Linux customer and you want to migrate to Appian on Kubernetes. We actually have a migration tool that will do it for you. So there's kind of 4 steps that happen during this process. One, we're going to export your existing Appian data. Secondly, we're going to back up all of your external data sources that you have running. And then we're basically going to do a prepare and merge, which is just what the migration tool does. You don't really have to worry about that. And then lastly, we're going to take that Appian data, which was just collected and prepared, and then import it into your new Kubernetes deployment. So we've tested this with a lot of customers, and so far it works really well, but we're looking for more. So if you're interested in using Appian on Kubernetes, please let us know. But we've tried to make it easy as possible. So if your team doesn't have tons of Kubernetes expertise or administration, like we're here to help you. So please let us know how we can. One thing to keep in mind now, there are certain products that are not currently available with Appian on Kubernetes that are only within Stratus. So portals, AI skills, and elastic process execution, these are things that in the future, we definitely want to have as part of the Appian on Kubernetes platform or offering. But as of right now, they're not. So this is something that our team in platform engineering works with the portals team, Epic's team, and AI skills. So once these are released, there'll be a huge announcement about it because we'll be very excited. But as of right now, just keep in mind if these are things that you are interested in using, they're not available yet. However, if you are interested in using them and you really want to use AOK, let us know because that's what we need to make sure that we're focusing on the next delivery for AOK and like what customers actually want to use. Lastly, after all of that, how do we feel? How do we feel about choosing Appian Cloud or Appian on Kubernetes? We're no longer a dog in a fire saying this is fine. Now we're saying we are the fire and we're surrounded by a bunch of happy puppies and this is fine. So if you have any questions, let us know. But thanks for listening and we'll be here for questions for a while. Thanks.